You felt it the moment it happened. Not the event itself, but the silence that followed. That strange, hollow quiet where something inside you just dropped. Not shattered, not exploded, just sank. And if you're honest, that's the part that confused you the most. Because you expected anger, you expected rage, maybe even clarity. But what you got instead was this heavy, disorienting stillness, like your mind was trying to protect you from fully understanding what just changed. Stay with me for a second, and if this already feels a little too familiar, then you might want to subscribe. Not for me, for you. Because conversations like this, you don't usually get them in your real life. Here's the thing no one says out loud. When someone betrays you, it's not just about what they did. It's about what your brain has to rewrite in order to keep going. You're not just processing their actions, you're quietly questioning your own judgment, your memory, your ability to read people, and that's where it gets dangerous. Because part of you starts scanning backwards. Was it always there? Did I ignore something? Was I naive? And you don't say those thoughts out loud. You carry them privately, almost like evidence against yourself. But what makes this even more complicated, and I need you to really hear this, is that betrayal doesn't just come from someone being cruel. Sometimes it comes from someone being weak, confused, avoidant. And I know there's a part of you that almost wants it to be cruelty, because cruelty is easier to understand. It gives you permission to close the door. But weakness? Weakness keeps the door slightly open, and that's why you're still thinking about it, still replaying things, still trying to make sense of someone who didn't even fully understand their own actions. You tell yourself you're over it, but your mind keeps returning to the same moments, adjusting small details, like if you just look at it from the right angle, it'll finally click. It won't. Not the way you think, because the truth is, the moment they betrayed you, something else quietly happened. Something they didn't expect. And I don't mean revenge. I don't mean some dramatic turnaround where you win. I mean something much more unsettling and much more powerful. But to understand that, you have to first admit something most men avoid admitting. You weren't just hurt by what they did. You were affected by what you believed about them. And that belief? That's where this story really begins. There's a moment after betrayal that most people miss entirely. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It happens in the most ordinary places, washing dishes, sitting in traffic, staring at your phone without really seeing it. It's the moment your mind stops trying to solve them and starts quietly separating them from the version of them you were holding inside you. And that separation? It hurts in a very specific way, because you're not just losing a person, you're losing the internal representation of that person, the one you protected, defended, explained, justified. Let me say that more clearly. You didn't only trust them, you trusted your interpretation of them. And when betrayal happens, that interpretation doesn't just crack, it starts to feel like it was never real at all. That's what creates the disorientation. Not just heartbreak, but identity confusion. You start asking questions like, how did I miss this? What does it say about me that I stayed so long? Was I being used? Or was I just willing to see what I wanted to see? And here's where I want to slow you down a little, because this is where men often turn on themselves without noticing it. You begin to confuse trust with stupidity. They are not the same thing. Trust is not a flaw. It's actually a sign that your nervous system is capable of connection, of risk, of emotional investment. But betrayal rewrites the meaning of that trust after the fact. It tries to convince you that openness was the mistake. And if you accept that too quickly, you don't just become guarded, you become smaller, less expressive, less emotionally available, more controlled in ways that feel like strength, but are really just fear wearing a different outfit. And I need you to notice something subtle here. The person who betrayed you has already moved on to their own version of the story. In their mind, it is often simplified, justified, reduced. But you are still living inside the complexity, still revisiting tone of voice, timing, expression, as if perfect understanding will somehow change the outcome. It won't. Because understanding is not the thing your mind is actually searching for. What you're really searching for is relief. Relief from the tension of not knowing how someone could be close to you and still act in a way that feels so disconnected from that closeness. And this is where something unexpected begins to form. Because while you are still trying to rebuild meaning from what happened, they are no longer thinking about it the same way. And that difference is where your power quietly starts to shift. But you don't feel that yet. Right now, it still feels like loss. And in some ways it is. But not everything you lose in this kind of experience is actually meant to stay with you. There's a phase after betrayal that nobody warns you about because it doesn't look like pain from the outside. It looks like calm. You might even fool yourself into thinking you're fine. You wake up, go through your routines, answer messages, smile at the right moments. On paper, everything functions. But internally, there's this strange emotional distance between you and your own life. Like you're slightly behind your own eyes. And this is where the mind does something very subtle. It starts rewriting meaning, not based on truth, but based on protection. It tries to reduce complexity, because complexity is what hurt you. So it begins to simplify people. She was never really that caring. They all do this eventually. You can't trust anyone fully. And I want you to notice something important here, because this is not wisdom. Not yet. It feels like insight, but it's actually a defense mechanism trying to prevent future disappointment by shrinking your expectations of connection. It's your mind saying, if I expect less, I won't feel this again. But there's a cost, because every time you shrink what you believe about people, you also shrink what you believe is possible for you. And without realizing it, you start becoming someone who doesn't fully enter experiences anymore. You observe them instead of living them. Now here's the part most men never connect. The person who betrayed you doesn't get to carry all the psychological consequences. You do. Not because you're weaker, but because you actually feel through things instead of disconnecting from them. And I know there's a temptation here to turn that into resentment, to think, that's not fair. But fairness is not what your nervous system is dealing with. Your nervous system is dealing with pattern recognition. It is trying to decide, was that a one-time rupture, or is this what closeness always leads to? And depending on how you answer that internally, your future changes shape. Slowly, quietly, without permission. Now, I want to tell you something that might not feel comforting at first, but it's important. The version of you that they betrayed is not the same version of you that exists now. That earlier version still believed effort could guarantee loyalty, that consistency would naturally lead to reciprocity, that emotional investment would be met with emotional care. And that version of you is not wrong. It was just operating with incomplete data. But here's what begins to happen next, and this is where things get psychologically interesting. Because while you think you are moving on, something else is forming underneath. A quiet recalibration, not of trust in people, but of trust in your own perception. And that's where the real shift begins, even if you don't recognize it yet. Because the most dangerous aftermath of betrayal is not bitterness, it's over-control. And you are about to see how that starts to form in ways you wouldn't normally notice. There's a point where healing stops looking like healing and starts looking like control. You won't call it that, of course. You'll call it standards. You'll call it self-respect. You'll call it being more careful this time. And some of that is true, but beneath it, something more interesting is happening. You begin to pre-edit your emotional life before it even unfolds. You pause longer before replying. You hold back details about yourself. You scan people for early signs of inconsistency, the way someone scans the sky for weather changes. And again, none of this feels dramatic. It feels intelligent. But there's a difference between awareness and hypervigilance. One keeps you present. The other keeps you protected at the cost of connection. And I want to be very precise here, because this is where many men quietly shift without noticing it. You don't just become more cautious, you become selectively unavailable. Not because you don't want connection, but because your nervous system now associates closeness with unpredictability. And here's the irony that almost nobody talks about. The person who betrayed you didn't just change your view of them, They changed how you experience neutral behavior. A delayed reply now feels loaded. A shift in tone feels like a warning sign. A moment of distance feels like a prelude. And your mind, trying to protect you, starts filling in gaps with worst-case interpretations. Not because you're irrational, but because uncertainty now feels expensive. Too expensive. So you start paying early. You withdraw before there's evidence. You detach before there's attachment. You leave emotionally before anything can catch you off guard again. And from the outside, this can look like growth, but internally, it can feel like quiet exhaustion, because you are always slightly ahead of your own emotions, trying to manage outcomes that haven't even happened yet. And here's where I want to gently challenge something you might be holding as truth now. That the lesson of betrayal is to trust less. It's not. The deeper lesson, one most people avoid because it requires vulnerability again, is to distinguish between risk and pattern. Not everyone is the same pattern, but when you've been hurt, your brain starts acting like it is safer to treat everyone as if they are. That's not insight, that's compression. And over time, compression changes who you become in relationships. You become efficient, yes, but also less reachable, less surprised, less open, less emotionally porous. And here's the part that quietly matters. The person who betrayed you is no longer living inside your emotional world the way you are living inside theirs. For them, it becomes a chapter. For you, it becomes a reference point. And that imbalance shapes how you interpret future moments more than you realize. But something is still forming underneath all of this, something they didn't expect, and it has nothing to do with revenge. It has to do with what you stop needing from people who cannot meet you fully. And that shift changes everything. At some point, you stop asking, why did they do it, in the same emotional way? Not because you fully understood them, but because something inside you gets tired of trying to solve a person who is no longer part of your life. And that's an important turning point, even if it feels quiet. Because when the mind gives up on resolution, it starts looking for restoration. But here's what restoration looks like after betrayal. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's subtle. You start noticing moments where you don't immediately react, where you pause before assigning meaning, where you allow silence to exist without filling it with interpretation. And this is where something shifts in you that they didn't anticipate. You stop emotionally chasing closure from people who cannot give it. And I don't mean you stop caring, I mean you stop outsourcing your emotional stability to their explanation. Because earlier, a part of you believed, maybe without saying it, that if they could just explain it correctly, it would somehow reorganize the pain. But explanations rarely heal betrayal. Because betrayal isn't just information gone wrong, it's attachment meeting inconsistency. And your nervous system remembers that more than your logic does. So now, instead of chasing answers from them, you begin, slowly, almost reluctantly, to build answers within yourself. Not perfect answers, just stable ones. And this is where I want you to notice something very specific about your internal world. The intensity of emotions starts to change shape. It doesn't disappear, that's not how this works, but it stops spiking in the same way. Because your mind begins to recognize patterns faster than it attaches meaning to them. And that recognition creates distance. Not emotional numbness, something more refined than that. Emotional selectivity. You begin to care more about consistency than explanation, more about behavior than promise, more about patterns than moments. And here's where the unexpected part begins to emerge. Because while you thought betrayal would make you more dependent on reassurance, it actually starts making you more sensitive to reality. Not what people say, but what they repeatedly do. And that shift is not small. It changes how you enter rooms, how you read silence, how you understand effort. And without you consciously deciding it, your internal standards reorganize themselves. But not in the way people usually assume. Not harder, not colder, just clearer. And clarity has a strange psychological effect. It removes emotional noise. And when emotional noise reduces, you start noticing something else. You are no longer as reachable by confusion. And that is where your presence begins to change. Not loudly, but in a way that people can feel before they can explain. And this is exactly what they didn't expect. Because they assumed betrayal would leave you stuck in the version of yourself that needed them to make sense of it. But something in you is already stepping beyond that version, even if you haven't fully seen it yet. There's a strange moment that comes later, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, where you realize you're no longer waiting for anything from them. Not an apology, not an explanation, not even a reaction. And the surprising part is, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like quiet detachment, almost like your emotional system finally stopped checking a door that was never going to open again. But I want to be careful here because this stage is often misunderstood. People assume detachment means you've moved on, but psychologically, it's more precise than that. It means your brain has stopped allocating energy toward prediction. And prediction is one of the most exhausting things we do in relationships. What will they say if I do this? What did that silence mean? Are things changing again? When betrayal happens, the mind becomes a kind of overactive analyst, constantly trying to stay ahead of emotional disruption. But at some point, something interesting begins to happen. You stop rehearsing outcomes. Not because you've become indifferent, but because your system recognizes that rehearsal no longer improves safety. And that realization creates space. Space you didn't have before. And in that space, something subtle but important returns. Your attention. Not your thoughts, not your analysis, your actual attention. The kind that lets you sit in a moment without splitting it into past and future. And this is where people around you might notice something before you fully do. You don't react as quickly, not because you're disconnected, but because you're no longer emotionally urgent. And urgency is what betrayal often installs in people without them noticing. Urgency to understand. Urgency to fix. Urgency to prevent it from happening again. But when urgency fades, something else takes its place. Stillness. And stillness can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because for a long time, your emotional system was trained to stay slightly ahead of pain. Now it isn't. Now it just observes. And here's the deeper layer most people miss. You don't become less emotional. You become less interrupted by emotion. There's a difference, and in that difference, your judgment starts to stabilize again, not because you're forcing it, but because it's no longer being pulled in multiple directions by fear and memory at the same time. And this is where the unexpected reversal begins, because the person who betrayed you likely assumed they were the reference point for your emotional state for a long time after they left, that their absence would keep shaping your reactions. But what actually happens is more subtle and more final than they expect. Their emotional relevance begins to shrink, not as a rejection, as a consequence of internal reorganization. And when someone stops being emotionally central in your mind, they also stop being powerful in your decisions. But there's still one final shift that hasn't fully formed yet, and it has less to do with them and everything to do with who you become when you no longer need emotional clarity from people who cannot offer it. There's a point where you look back and realize something that doesn't arrive with emotion at first. It arrives with silence. Not the painful kind anymore, but the kind that feels like space has finally returned to your mind. And in that space, you notice something uncomfortable but important. You didn't just survive what happened. You changed how you relate to reality because of it. Not in a dramatic personality shift kind of way, in a quieter recalibration. You no longer take emotional presence for granted. You no longer confuse intensity with honesty. You no longer assume closeness automatically means alignment. And that's not cynicism. That's refinement through experience. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting, and where most people miss the deeper outcome of betrayal entirely. Because the person who betrayed you expected one of two things. Either you would collapse into resentment, or you would chase resolution forever. But what they didn't anticipate was something far less visible. You would outgrow the emotional version of yourself that needed them to make sense of what they did. And that kind of growth doesn't announce itself, it just quietly removes access. Not access to you physically, access to your emotional center. And that changes everything, because once someone is no longer the emotional reference point, Their actions stop shaping your internal world in the same way. They become part of your past, but no longer part of your emotional decision-making. And I want to say this carefully because it's easy to misunderstand. This isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming accurate. Accurate about patterns, accurate about behavior over time, accurate about what you will and will not participate in again. And accuracy has a calming effect on the nervous system that no amount of reassurance can replicate, because reassurance depends on others. Accuracy depends on you. And somewhere in this process, something else happens too, something subtle but profound. You stop trying to be understood by people who were never willing to understand you consistently. Not because you've given up on connection, but because you've stopped confusing inconsistency with depth. And that changes how you show up in every future relationship, romantic or otherwise. You don't become harder to love, you become harder to misread. And that is what they didn't expect. Not that you would move on, not that you would heal, but that you would become someone who no longer organizes his emotional reality around people who once misunderstood his value. And maybe the most important part of all of this is the simplest. What broke your trust didn't end your capacity for connection. It refined your ability to choose where it belongs. And once that happens, you don't need closure from them anymore, because the closure was never in what they could explain. It was in what you finally stopped needing to hear from them at all.